A thunderclap of applause shook the gilded ballroom of Washington's Hay Adams Hotel, but Charles Koch didn't flinch. On the mounted television, a breaking news alert read, "Supreme Court rules in favor of Citizens United." It was January 21, 2010. For most, it was a legal curiosity. For Charles, it was the key to an empire. Behind his horn-rimmed glasses, a plan decades in the making snapped into focus. He stepped away from the jubilant crowd of political consultants and lobbyists, his footsteps soundless on the thick Persian rug. Charles muttered, "Now we build, not with excitement but purpose." This wasn't conquest. It was orchestration. The court had just uncorked a vault, unlimited political spending, no transparency. To the public, it was law. To Charles, it was a green light. As the party roared around him, he imagined the blueprint: dark money groups, think tanks, educational arms. Not politics. Engineering. A quiet revolution had just begun. In a stark glass-paneled conference room at Koch Industries' Wichita headquarters, two aides waited nervously as Charles entered, carrying a single manila folder. He placed it on the table with deliberate calm. "Gentlemen, we're no longer just investing in companies," he said. "We're investing in America's perception of freedom." The aides exchanged glances. Inside the folder, the outline for Americans for Prosperity, a shell that would grow into a hydra. Think tanks, PACs, grassroots fronts, an invisible skeleton grafted onto democracy. Charles didn't raise his voice. His power wasn't charisma. It was calculation. The room, sleek with steel and frosted glass, felt colder as he detailed the plan. "We don't need to win elections," he said. "We need to shape who runs." The silence afterward was not confusion. It was awe. That spring, in an unmarked brick building on the outskirts of Arlington, Virginia, a soft launch took place. The first Americans for Prosperity office opened with no press, no fanfare. Just a dozen staffers' laptops and prepaid cell phones. Charles never visited. He didn't need to. He'd seeded a force that would multiply in whispers. "We're not building a party," the project manager told recruits. "We're building a movement." Money began to flow, first in trickles, then floods. Ads, mailers, policy papers. Town halls in towns no one had heard of. Behind every pamphlet, every bus tour, every TV spot, was a Koch dollar. Yet no one could see his name. That was the magic. It looked local. It felt real. But it was orchestrated power, camouflaged and calculated. Reporters tried to trace the funds. They hit legal walls: 501, C4s, Shell LCS, donor-advised funds. To the public, Americans for Prosperity was a grassroots phenomenon. To Charles, it was a lattice of plausible deniability. In an interview, a young journalist asked him if he believed billionaires had too much influence. Charles smiled faintly and said, "Influence only matters if it's visible." The quote never aired. Editors pulled it. Too vague. But it was the closest glimpse anyone ever got of his endgame. Not visibility. Control. Quiet, sustained control. Not by votes. By frameworks. By choosing which ideas lived and which ones died before they reached ballots. By the midterms of 2010, the machine roared to life. In swing states, Tea Party rallies surged with Koch-backed signage. Liberty, taxed enough already, words that felt homegrown but were printed in bulk by vendors Koch Industries quietly funded. Charles watched returns roll in from a private room in Wichita. As blue seats flipped red, he simply nodded. He didn't celebrate. That wasn't the point. This wasn't about Republicans. It was about malleability. With the right pressure, anyone could be shaped. And America, drowning in recession and distrust, was ready to be molded. The empire wasn't coming. It had already arrived, through the back door of democracy. In the heat of a 1940s Kansas summer, Fred Koch sat at his workbench, sweat dripping from his brow as he soldered a crude pipeline schematic. He wasn't building just for profit. He was building for defiance. Years before, he had found opportunity not in America but in Stalin's Russia, constructing refineries while dreaming of independence. That experience scarred him. Fred returned to Wichita with fire in his belly and distrust in his bones. Communism, unions, government interference, they were threats, not theories. His sons would inherit that belief. Charles, the second eldest, sat silently in the corner of the workshop, his eyes fixed on his father's hands. Fred once told him, "If you let them control your life, you'll never own yourself." That phrase would echo for decades. Not a motto, a doctrine. Charles didn't just inherit an oil business. He inherited a philosophy: control or be controlled. By the 1970s, Charles Koch had assumed control of the family business. But his mind wasn't on oil. It was on Hayek, Mises, Rothbard, men whose pages he consumed like scripture. He built a private library at Koch headquarters, walls lined with leather-bound volumes of Austrian economics and libertarian thought. Staffers called it the Shrine. In company memos, he used phrases like spontaneous order and market virtue. But this wasn't eccentricity. It was design. Business isn't just profit, he wrote in one early memo. It's a platform to resist coercion. Charles wasn't merely running Koch Industries. Oh, he was preparing for a war of ideas. Regulations were chains. Unions were parasites. The government was a distortion field. In these beliefs, he saw not politics but morality. Behind every king is a court. By the early 2000s, Charles Koch had handpicked his ideological knights: academics, lobbyists, strategists. They called it the Seminar Network. Twice a year, in undisclosed resort locations they gathered. Billionaires, CEOs, senators, economists. They didn't speak in bombast. They spoke in metrics: cost per vote, mind-share ratios, legislative reach. One strategist joked, "We're not donors, we're investors with OI." Charles rarely joked back. For him, these weren't gatherings. They were tactical briefings. From these rooms came roadmaps: state laws to rewrite, universities to endow, candidates to test. Not with noise, with precision. They didn't need the spotlight. They needed shadows. Real power, Charles believed, doesn't need applause. It needs impact. In 2012, a young Koch employee sent an internal memo suggesting the company back off from its hardline political stances. The response was swift and final. Security escorted him out by lunch. The message was clear: dissent wasn't dangerous, it was disloyalty. At Koch Industries, alignment wasn't suggested, it was expected. During town halls, Charles would open with calm questions, but he always steered conversation back to principles. "We don't operate by consensus," he once said. "We operate by conviction." Over time, the culture hardened. Executives who once argued now nodded. Innovation was welcome, but only within the framework. Freedom wasn't about choice. It was about discipline. And in Charles' mind, that discipline separated empires from relics. By 2014, the Koch network was rehearsing influence like choreography. A single call could fund a state senator, flip a school board, or block a carbon tax. Charles monitored this from a dashboard, literally. Inside a high-security control room nicknamed the Nerve Center, analysts tracked campaign success rates, media mentions, donor activity. Think Google Analytics, but for power. And yet, Charles still insisted on the long view. "You don't win by winning today," he told his chief strategist. "You win by making tomorrow impossible for your enemies." It wasn't paranoia. It was permanence. The empire's reach was no longer just national. It was systemic. Invisible fingers nudging the rudder of a nation. By 2015, the Koch network operated like a syndicate. Americans for Prosperity had hundreds of field offices, rivaling national political parties. Heritage, Cato, ALEC, think tanks became weaponized factories of policy. State legislators received model bills in sealed folders, written not by lawmakers, but by lobbyists. Charles didn't need to argue. He just needed to present options. One state rep recalled, "They gave me the votes before I even read the bill." The brilliance lay in plausible origin stories. Every front looked homegrown, every law grassroots. But behind the scenes, campaign contributions mapped perfectly onto compliance. Resistance didn't mean defeat. It meant exclusion. The system didn't punish you. It ignored you. That was the art of soft power. Control not through force, but through relevance. In Oklahoma, the Koch plan ran headlong into fury. Years of tax cuts had gutted public services. Teachers, some making less than fast food workers, walked out. They marched for miles to the Capitol, wearing red, holding signs, "Fund our future." Charles watched the footage from Wichita without expression. He didn't fear anger. He feared coherence. A movement born in pain could disrupt his algorithm. Americans for Prosperity launched counterads overnight. "Unions don't teach kids," one ad declared. Behind the curtain, analysts flagged counties where dissent surged. "Re-educate or replace," read one Koch memo. In this empire, even rebellion was data, and data had its own response. When climate science surged into the mainstream, Koch Industries doubled down. Internal emails showed a strategy labeled delay, distract, discredit. Charles wasn't blind to the facts. He just rejected their urgency. "Panic is manipulation," he told his board. Millions flowed into denialist think tanks. Scientists who opposed consensus were elevated. State textbooks softened language around fossil fuels. It wasn't about denying climate change. It was about reshaping what it meant. Words like uncertain and complex became tools. One strategist said, "We're not selling lies, we're selling doubt." In courtrooms and classrooms, the result was the same: confusion. And confusion was policy's greatest shield. In 2016, a flash drive arrived anonymously at a journalist's office in D.C. Inside, donor lists, internal playbooks, Koch memos. For the first time, the scaffolding was visible. Names of judges, university departments, even pastors, all funded with strategic intent. The story broke on a Friday. The internet ignited. But by Monday, cable news had moved on. A distraction. A tweet storm. A celebrity scandal. Charles's media team activated containment. "Stay silent," he instructed. "Visibility feeds fire." And he was right. Within a week, the outrage dimmed. But the leak revealed a truth. The empire wasn't invincible. It could be seen. And what could be seen could be fought. Not all threats came from outside. Inside the Koch family, fault lines deepened. David Koch, more moderate and socially libertarian, began to question the scope of their influence. "We wanted freedom," he told Charles in a private meeting, "not omnipresence." Charles didn't reply. To him, the mission had outgrown sentiment. When David stepped back from politics due to illness, Charles centralized control. Other brothers had long been exiled, legal battles, media blackouts. In building a machine to shape America, Charles had sacrificed the unity of the very family that bore its name. The empire was tighter than ever, but it was lonelier than ever too. In a plain lecture hall at George Mason University, a classroom of law students took notes from a guest speaker, an appeals court judge with ties to Koch-funded seminars. What they didn't know, their tuition, professors, and even curriculum had been shaped by millions in Koch donations. Through endowments and grants, Charles Koch had embedded a generation of libertarian legal thought into academia. Judicial training conferences followed, sponsored by seemingly independent nonprofits, all traceable back to Wichita. One leaked email read, "The bench is the battlefield." It wasn't about bribery. It was about worldview. Judges didn't need to be told how to rule if they were already trained to see the world through Koch's lens. The courtrooms of tomorrow were being forged in classrooms today. In suburban North Carolina, a small Baptist church received a surprise donation from a family values foundation. The new funding came with media kits, sermon guides, and Patriot curriculum for children. What the pastor didn't realize was the foundation was part of a Koch-aligned shell network. In exchange for nothing more than ideological alignment, churches became information nodes, delivering political messaging from the pulpit under the guise of faith. Topics like taxation, energy policy, and regulation entered sermons wrapped in scripture. "This isn't politics," the pastor told his congregation. "It's moral clarity." Charles had discovered a new front, not just changing policy, but shaping souls. By 2018, Koch analysts were no longer just watching poll numbers, they were studying attention. Teams inside the I360 project tracked millions of voter data points, clicks, shares, watch time. Algorithms determined who was persuadable, who needed reinforcement, and who could be isolated. "We don't chase voters," a lead data engineer said. "We cultivate behavior." Koch-funded influencers, disguised as local news, seeded doubt on climate, taxes, immigration. The lines between truth and narrative blurred, by design. Charles once remarked, "Information is the battlefield. The one who defines the question wins the answer." It wasn't about censorship. It was about framing. And the frame was getting smaller. In a Midwestern newsroom, a veteran investigative journalist prepared to run a story linking Koch funding to anti-environmental legislation. But hours before publication, the editor pulled the piece. A call had come from ownership, subtle but clear. This could jeopardize partnerships. It wasn't the first time. Koch Industries had quietly become one of the largest advertisers in regional media. Their dollars spoke louder than facts. Reporters were never threatened. They were nudged, redirected, or reassigned. One former editor admitted, "You start to self-censor before anyone asks you to." That was the genius. Charles didn't need to control the media. He just needed it to hesitate. In journalism, hesitation was a form of obedience. While most eyes focused on American politics, Koch strategists were writing checks overseas. In Brazil, think tanks emerged overnight opposing climate regulation. In Eastern Europe, Liberty conferences hosted young activists trained in free market doctrine. Charles didn't believe in borders. He believed in systems. And any system that restricted capital was an enemy. The same blueprint that had reshaped U.S. policy was now going global. Media manipulation, judicial pipelines, academic infiltration. Freedom, in the Koch doctrine, was a portable product. One memo put it plainly: wherever regulation rises, opportunity follows. The empire had grown beyond a nation. It had become a model, a scalable framework of ideological conquest. Charles Koch stood alone in his Wichita office, a wall of windows overlooking flat Kansas plains fading into dusk. On the polished wood table beside him sat an open letter, unsigned, typed, and untraceable. It read, "You built a kingdom on silence, but silence is crumbling." The words weren't a threat. They were a reckoning. For the first time in decades, Charles felt something unfamiliar: exposure. Leaks, protests, digital footprints, control was slipping. He ran his hand across the glass, watching the sun disappear behind oil silos. Power had always been about invisibility. Now the curtain was fraying. And somewhere beneath the calculations, the philosopher in him wondered, had they gone too far? Was liberty preserved or weaponized? His reflection in the window stared back, emotionless. Not guilt, not pride, just weight. Outside the Kansas state capitol, a new kind of protest brewed. Not teachers, not activists. This time it was Koch Industries' own employees, engineers, drivers, clerks. "We make billions, but can't afford our own health care," shouted a foreman through a bullhorn. Signs read "Invisible no more," And we built this empire. It was unprecedented. Internal rebellion. Charles was briefed in minutes. The security team wanted dispersal. Charles said no. He wanted to watch. From a distant building behind mirrored glass he observed the scene. The irony wasn't lost on him. The machine he built to bend governments was being rejected by its own gears. The empire hadn't just grown. It had mutated. And now, it was turning inward. In a hushed Capitol Hill meeting room, a Koch-aligned senator introduced a last-minute amendment to a sweeping regulatory bill. The language was opaque, buried under jargon, but its impact was seismic. It would dismantle decades of environmental safeguards with a single paragraph. Lobbyists in tailored suits hovered just outside the chamber, phones buzzing with anticipation. But this time, something snapped. A junior representative, newly elected and once backed by Koch PACs, stood to object. "We weren't elected to serve ghosts," she declared. Silence rippled through the room. Cameras captured her words. For the first time, the empire's influence met open defiance on the floor. Not from opposition. From within its own ranks. David Koch's final days were quiet. Confined to his Manhattan penthouse, he watched the news with the volume low. Reports of climate catastrophes, economic protests, political turmoil. The world they'd helped sculpt was on fire. But David no longer spoke of politics. His conversations turned to art, to his children, to silence. In a rare interview, he whispered, "We tried to control something that was never ours." When news of his death broke, networks aired tributes: philanthropist, titan, patriot. But in hushed corners of boardrooms and backrooms, the tone was different. His absence created a void, and Charles filled it with steel. Grief didn't weaken the empire. It distilled it. Back in Wichita, a private meeting unfolded between Charles and a young strategist. The numbers were clear. Public trust in the Koch name had cratered. Even allies now used aliases to avoid blowback. "Do we rebrand?" the strategist asked. Charles shook his head. "No," he said. "We go deeper, deeper than names." From a drawer, he pulled a new map, not of states, but of networks. Digital. Decentralized. Invisible. Politics was the surface. This is the substrate. The strategist stared in awe. Charles had already moved beyond legacy, beyond elections. He wasn't salvaging an empire. He was rebirthing it. In code, in crypto, in infrastructure unseen. The final evolution of influence wouldn't be televised. It would be embedded. A subpoena arrived at Koch Industries headquarters under sealed federal directive. Years of financial entanglements, nonprofits, subsidiaries, super PACs were finally under review. Not for tax evasion. For influence trafficking. Behind closed doors, lawyers gathered like surgeons. Charles sat at the end of the table, unreadable. "They won't find what they're looking for," one counsel said. "Because we were never hiding." That was the irony. The true genius of the empire was never in secrecy, but structure. Yet for the first time, sunlight threatened the design. Regulatory heat wasn't about legality, it was about legitimacy. Charles didn't blink. "Let them look," he said. "They won't know what they're seeing." Because to unravel the web, you first had to admit it existed. At a data center in Utah, engineers discovered a dormant system pinging outdated Koch proxies, ghost accounts linked to disbanded PACs and deleted domains. It wasn't malicious. It was residue. The digital architecture Koch had built to shape democracy had become self-perpetuating. Aids launched without authors. Emails triggered without commands. "It's not a botnet," one analyst said. "It's a ghost." What Charles built wasn't just strategy. It was infrastructure. And now, fragments of it continued without him. Somewhere in the code, old priorities echoed like radio signals from another war. The strategist overseeing the audit whispered, "This thing doesn't need a king anymore." Because the machine no longer obeyed a throne. It obeyed momentum. In Silicon Valley, a young billionaire presented a pitch titled Decentralized Liberty. The slide deck echoed familiar phrases: freedom, deregulation, disruption. But these weren't Koch words, they were his echoes. Charles, watching from Wichita, recognized them instantly. The next generation wasn't resisting him. They were replicating him. Not through oil or mailers, but through blockchain, DAOs, and synthetic media. This isn't rebellion, Charles murmured. It's evolution. He wasn't obsolete. He was blueprint. The empire's core had become a concept, one that no longer required his hand. In that realization came both triumph and terror. For what begins as order often ends as wildfire. Charles sat alone in his home study, a copy of Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty resting in his lap, dotting. Outside, wind whipped the Kansas fields into golden waves. The bookshelves around him were worn from decades of annotation. Margin notes, underlines, circles. But tonight, his hands didn't move. He wasn't calculating. He was remembering. The factory floor with his father. The first anonymous check to a think tank. The memo that launched a movement. So much built. So much shaped. And yet, the one thing he could never command was time. History would have its own lens. It might not call him villain or hero, but it would speak his name. Quietly, like a shadow cast long after the light source vanished. A ballot dropped into a box in a rural American town. A teenager voted for the first time, unaware that the touchscreen vendor was once owned by a firm tied to Koch funding. Her choice was informed by a podcast, funded by a think tank, funded by a PAC, funded by a donor-advised fund, and so on. The empire wasn't dead. It had been abstracted. What once wore the name Koch now wore no name at all. And yet people still chose, still acted, still resisted or surrendered. Influence had evolved, but so had awareness. In the end, the final battle wasn't between left and right, billionaire and bureaucrat. It was between knowing and not knowing. The last move Koch made was never felt, because it was never meant to be. Power, real power, is the move you never see. And sometimes, the one even you forget you made. A legacy documentary aired late one night, on PBS Diet. The Architects of American Power, it was titled. Charles Koch's name appeared just once, spoken, not shown. An older political historian narrated, "Few people have shaped American democracy without ever standing for election." Koch was one. Grainy footage rolled. Oil fields, courtrooms, rallies, algorithmic war rooms. The audience was small. But for the first time, an unfiltered story flickered across the screen. No lawsuits. No rebuttals. Just footage, facts, names, dates. The myth was giving way to the archive. The empire, so long protected by anonymity, was becoming history. And in that moment, uncelebbrated and unnoticed, something fragile was born. Memory. Charles Koch passed quietly, in the same Wichita home where he once drafted his first ideological memo. No grand statement. No funeral broadcast. His obituary, brief and clinical, ran beneath a feature on a celebrity divorce. But across inboxes and secure servers, one alert echoed. KG 7, terminal. It was the internal signal for a shift. Automated protocols activating across foundations, trusts, data silos. The empire didn't grieve. It rebooted. Staff met in glass towers, with no time for mourning. Strategy must outlive the strategist. That was always the plan. And yet, a former speechwriter wept alone at his desk. Not for the man, but for what his absence would unleash. When restraint dies with its architect, what remains? The heirs gathered, not as family, but as shareholders. In a Manhattan skyscraper boardroom, the empire's future was parsed into slides and share ratios. Some wanted reinvention, green investments, transparency, a softer face. Others wanted legacy, unbent. The room buzzed with decorum and detachment. Absent was vision. Absent was fire. Charles had always feared the dilution of conviction. Conviction without clarity becomes compromise, he once wrote. And now, the empire he forged from steel and thought was being softened by PR firms and quarterly forecasts. No one argued. No one rebelled. The machine would survive, but as something else. Something gentler. Something lesser. Perhaps even mortal. In a university lecture decades later, a young professor presented a case study titled The Koch Doctrine. Her students debated its ethics, mechanisms, and legacy. One argued it saved capitalism. Another said it hollowed democracy. But all agreed it worked. True influence, the professor said, isn't measured by loyalty. It's measured by how much of the world still runs on your logic when you're gone. The class sat silent. Not out of fear, but awe. Koch's fingerprints weren't just on ballots or budgets. They were in the way problems were framed, in the architecture of thought itself. The final legacy of Charles Koch wasn't money. It was epistemology. And so the empire endures, not in headlines or statues, but in frameworks and reflexes. In invisible funding trails. In institutions that no longer remember their patron. In laws no one questions because they've always been. Charles Koch did not chase immortality. He engineered it. Not through worship. Through design. No closing speech. No final camera push-in. Just systems set in motion that never needed his name to function. If democracy is a story we agree to tell ourselves, Koch Industries rewrote the grammar. And now, every page, every policy, every protest, every click, is subtly stamped by a man who never asked to be seen. The empire is quiet. And that's how it won.